The wind had teeth. It gnawed through her shawl and bit at her skin as she stood at the edge of the frostbitten field, a child clinging to each hand and two more pressed against her skirt. Their cheeks were raw from the cold, their small eyes squinting toward the sunless stretch of prairie that rolled out before them like punishment. Behind them, the house sagged with the weight of what it had seen. The roof bowed. The door hung crooked, broken at the hinge. Smoke hadn't risen from the chimney in days. Miriam's boots were soaked through the mud, gripping at her heels like it wanted her to stay and rot with the bones of the place. Her husband's grave lay behind the barn, a simple wooden cross marked with his name, Jonas Coalfather, farmer drunk. Buried with him were the promises he'd made and the debts he hadn't paid. The bankman had come that morning, wore a black coat and a white face. Said the land wasn't theirs anymore, hadn't been for months. Said there was nowhere for a widow with 4 children and no means to stay. Said they had until sundown to be gone. She hadn't cried, not in front of him, just nodded, bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. After he left, she'd gone inside and packed what little they had. 3 quilts, 1 pan, a half sack of flour, a cracked Bible. Her youngest Ruth wouldn't stop coughing. She watched the road now, though no wagon was coming. No neighbor would help them. Jonas had burned those bridges one by one with whiskey and fists, and now she stood here waiting for a miracle she didn't believe in. Mama Sarah said, her mitten tugging at Miriam's hand. "It's cold." "I know," she whispered. Her voice was sand. "We'll go soon." "Where?" Miriam didn't answer. The sky stretched gray and hollow overhead like the inside of a coffin lid. The land was sleeping, or maybe just pretending. Dry corn stalks rattled in the breeze, ghosts of a harvest that never came. A hawk wheeled far above its wings, cutting quiet patterns into the sky. She turned back toward the house. The memory of warmth lingered faintly at the door, bread, firewood, the soft shape of Jonas before the bottle twisted him. She could still see him standing there in the early days, shirtless, calloused hands reaching for hers with something like hope in his eyes. It was a long time ago. Another life. Behind her, a rider approached. She heard the hooves before she saw the man. The sound thudded in her chest, strange and out of place. She turned. He came slow, as if the cold pressed down on his mount, a tall bay horse with a limp on its front left leg. The rider wore a tan coat stained with dust and time. His hat was low. She couldn't see his face. He stopped a dozen yards from them and tipped his hat. Silence stretched. "You, the widow Cole?" he asked. His voice wasn't cruel, just flat. "I am." He nodded once. "Name's Carrigan. Will Carrigan. Sheriff sent me to see if you needed escort to town." Miriam straightened. The boy at her side sniffled. "We don't need charity," she said. Carrigan didn't answer right away. He dismounted slow, like his bones ached. "Didn't say it was charity. Just that town's far and your littles look cold. There's room in the back if you want it." She looked at his wagon, a flatbed hitched behind the horse. Nothing fancy, just planks and wheels. An old blanket folded in the corner. She wanted to say no. She wanted to scream. Instead she said, "We'll ride." He helped her lift the children one by one. Didn't speak. Didn't judge. Just steadied them and stepped back. When it came time for her, he held out a hand. She took it. His palm was warm. They rode in silence, the cold biting harder with each mile. Her children huddled, close faces hidden in her coat. Carrigan walked beside them, leading the horse on foot. She watched the way he moved, the way his eyes scanned the horizon like he expected trouble to rise out of the snow. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer comfort. But when Ruth began to cough again, deep and harsh, He pulled a flask from his coat, poured a few drops onto a cloth, and handed it to Miriam. "It's just peppermint and pine," he said. "Helps my chest in winter." She held it to Ruth's nose. The little girl whimpered, then calmed. "Thank you." Kerrigan just nodded. They kept going, and for the first time in weeks she began to think maybe the road didn't only lead to endings. The wagon wheels creaked through the frozen ruts, the sound carrying over the empty fields like the groan of old bones. In the distance a hawthorn tree stood stripped and bare against the flat light, its limbs crooked like fingers reaching for something long gone. Miriam didn't look back. What was behind her could stay buried. The children dozed against her, their small bodies twitching with the cold lips chapped and blue at the edges. She kept one hand around Ruth, the other braced against the side of the wagon to stay upright. Her limbs ached stiff and swollen from days of work and hunger. The road blurred in her vision, but she didn't let herself close her eyes. Kerrigan hadn't said much, not even when they passed the burnt-out homestead a few miles west, the one the locals whispered about. A family gone in a fire, or maybe something worse. The ruins still smoked some nights, folks said. Miriam didn't ask. She just watched him walk beside the wagon, shoulders squared, hand near the old rifle slung across his back. He didn't look like the law, more like a man who'd once tried to run from it and failed. His coat was frayed at the cuffs. His boots were patched. There was something in the way he moved, careful but not afraid, like someone who had known both violence and silence too long to be rattled by either. "Is there work in town?" she asked. He glanced up at her brow, low beneath his hat. "Some. Not much this time of year. You sew." She nodded. "Mrs. Greeley runs the boarding house. Her hands don't work so well anymore. Could be she needs help." Miriam nodded, though her throat tightened. Help was one thing. A roof for 4 children was another. Kerrigan seemed to sense the weight of her thoughts. He didn't push. They reached the edge of town by dusk. Lights glowed behind windows, dim and yellow, like eyes watching from a distance. Smoke rose from chimneys. A dog barked once, sharp and uncertain. The wagon slowed near the old chapel, its steeple dark against the graying sky. Kerrigan stopped them in front of a squat building with a crooked sign, Cresswell and Sons General Store. He stepped up onto the porch and knocked. The door opened on a tall man with thick gray whiskers and a heavy apron. His eyes moved from Kerrigan to Miriam and the sleeping children without surprise or much welcome. "Evening," Kerrigan said. "Got a family needs shelter." Cresswell's lips pressed into a line. "Ain't got room." "Didn't ask for your house," Kerrigan said, voice level. "Just the loft. For one night. Maybe 2. She got king." "No." Cresswell sighed and scratched his neck. "Hey, up there's Moldy." "We'll manage," Miriam said, finding her voice. Cresswell looked at her again. Something shifted in his face, not softness, but a kind of reluctant respect. He stepped aside. "Ladder's out back," he said. "Don't burn anything. And keep the young uns quiet." They settled into the loft as night wrapped itself tight around the town. The hay smelled sharp and sour, but it was dry and it was high off the ground. The children curled up in the quilts, Ruth pressed against her side like a second heartbeat. Kerrigan didn't stay. He lingered by the ladder long enough to hand her a wrapped bundle of cornbread and smoked meat. "For the littles," he said. She looked at it, then at him. "Why are you helping us?" His eyes didn't waver. "Because someone should have helped my ma and no one did." He turned, boots thudding on the wood, and disappeared into the dark. Later, when the children slept and her hands were still from exhaustion, Miriam watched the sliver of moon through a crack in the roof. She felt the ache of the day pull at her bones, but beneath it a small warmth smoldered. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But it was the start of something. Subscribe and don't let this road grow cold. Morning broke slow and colorless. The gray light slipped through the cracks in the loft like a secret too tired to stay hidden. Miriam opened her eyes to the smell of damp hay and sleeping children. Ruth's breath was soft against her shoulder, the only sound in the hush. For a long while she didn't move. Her body ached from the hard floor muscles knotted from cold and tension. Her back throbbed from holding Ruth all night, but she didn't shift. Let the child sleep, she thought. Let the quiet stay just a little longer. Eventually Sarah stirred. Then John, the oldest, stretched out a leg and kicked straw across the loft. Soon they were all waking, blinking in the light, shivering. There was nothing to cook with. No stove. No matches. Just what Kerrigan had left, the cornbread wrapped in wax paper and a bit of meat gone dry but edible. Miriam broke it up into pieces, handing it out quietly, watching their faces. "Is this breakfast?" asked Eli, her middle boy mouth already full. "It's what we have," she said. No one complained. They never did. Hunger had made them quiet over time. When the children finished, she brushed the crumbs from their hands and stood. Her knees popped. She tied her hair back with a scrap of ribbon, the same one she'd used since before Ruth was born. Then she led them down the ladder one by one. Cresswell was opening the store when she stepped outside. He gave her a look that wasn't unkind but not welcoming either. Just tired. The whole town wore that look, it seemed. "I'll earn our stay," she said, meeting his eyes. "Whatever needs doing." He eyed the children gathered behind her. "You ever sweep?" She nodded. "Good. Do it before the morning rush. Keep the littles out of the way." She worked for hours, sweeping out dust that had settled deep in the corners, scrubbing shelves with water too cold for comfort. Her hands stung, but she didn't stop. She didn't look for Kerrigan either, though she expected she would. He showed up just after midday. The door jingled when he stepped in, snow still clinging to his coat. He nodded once at Cresswell, then glanced toward Miriam, where she stood behind the counter. "You free?" he asked. She wiped her hands and followed him outside. "You ride?" he asked. "Not well." He nodded. "You'll learn." He led her to a horse tied beside the smithy, an old roan with a quiet look in its eyes. "We're going out west of town. Family there needs firewood brought in. Pays small but steady." Miriam hesitated. "What about the children?" "They can stay with Miss Greeley today. She knows." She didn't ask how or why. She just nodded and climbed up behind him. The ride was rough. The wind slapped her cheeks raw, and every jolt of the saddle sent pain through her spine. But she held tight, and she didn't complain. Kerrigan didn't speak either, not for a long while. He just rode, guiding the horse along frozen trails that cut through pine groves and low creek. The land opened up ahead of them, wide and bone-white, with hills soft as folded cloth beneath the snow. A cabin stood there low to the ground, with smoke rising from the chimney. They unloaded the wagon together, chopped wood side by side. She watched the way he worked, measured, deliberate, never wasting effort. He handed her the axe once, showed her how to split with her weight, not her arms. She hit crooked the first time, and the second. Again, he said. She tried. Got it better the third. When they paused to rest, he pulled a flask from his coat and took a sip. He didn't offer it. She didn't ask. "My pa wasn't much good," he said after a long silence. "But he taught me to build a fire in snow. Said cold, don't care if you're tired. Said work's the only thing that keeps you alive out here." Miriam looked down at her hands, red and cracked. "He was right," she said. Kerrigan didn't smile, but something in his face softened. He stood, grabbed another log. "You ever want to learn more?" he said. "I'll teach you." She looked up at him. "All right," she said. They rode back in the dark, and her hands were raw and her arms shook from the strain. But that night, when she tucked her children in and curled beside them on the loft floor, She felt something unfamiliar move through her. Strength, maybe, or the memory of it returning. By the third week her hands no longer blistered. The calluses came in hard and fast, like the prairie had claimed her skin as its own. She'd stopped wincing when the axe bit into the wood, stopped apologizing when she couldn't lift more. Kerrigan never asked her to. He just handed her the next log. The days passed quiet and bitter. Snow crusted the edges of every roof in town, and the wind carried wood smoke through the streets like a warning. Folks began to nod to her when she passed, slow, wary nods, the kind you gave to someone who might stick around. Miriam didn't return them. Not yet. Trust was a currency she had no reason to spend. She worked, swept the store, hauled water, learned how to mend harness leather in the back of the livery. When Kerrigan came by, he brought her with him, sometimes into the hills to deliver food to old men with no teeth, sometimes to split ice for cattle troughs outside lonely farms. She asked no questions. He offered no reasons, but he always came. One morning Miss Greeley handed her a bundle of linen and pointed to the sewing table by the window. "You've got sharp hands," the old woman said. "These curtains won't 'em themselves." Miriam sat. The needle felt good between her fingers, clean, precise. Something she could control. She worked in silence for an hour before Miss Greeley spoke again. "You got plans?" the woman asked, not looking up. "Just to keep my children warm." "That's a fine plan. But winter don't last forever." Miriam didn't answer. She didn't know how to think beyond the snow. That afternoon, Kerrigan brought her to a place outside town where the hills cut sharp against the horizon. A half-frozen stream ran through a narrow ravine, and pine needles lay thick beneath their boots. "This is mine," he said, gesturing to the land. Miriam blinked at him. "You own this?" "My grandfather did. Left it to me. Folks don't know. Would rather believe I'm just drifting." "Why don't you build on it?" He looked out over the trees. "I did once. Before the war. Fire took it." She watched his jaw tighten, a muscle twitching there. "You could build again." He didn't respond. She walked a little ahead, boots crunching over the frost. The air smelled of pine and frozen earth. A bird called high above, sharp and quick, like it had somewhere to be. When she turned back, he was watching her, not like a man looking at a woman, but like someone trying to decide if the world might start again. "You never ask for anything," he said. "No one listens when I do." "I would. Miriam looked away. "I wouldn't know what to ask." They walked back as the sun slipped behind the ridge, painting the sky in a bruised kind of gold. At the edge of town she stopped. "My boy John," she said. "He's 12. He wants to work." Kerrigan nodded. "I can take him out next run. Teach him to haul." She hesitated, then said, "He's not like his father." "I didn't figure he was." They stood in the road, neither quite moving, as snow began to fall again, slow, quiet flakes that caught in her hair and melted down her collar. "You're not like him either," she said. Kerrigan's eyes narrowed a little, not in anger, but like the words had landed somewhere he wasn't used to being touched. Then he nodded once and tipped his hat. "I'll see you tomorrow." That night Miriam sat with the children curled around her, and she let herself think for just a moment what a spring might look like. Not the far-off kind, but the real one. The one that came after all the snow melted and the ground softened enough for seeds again. The kind that asked for faith and gave something back. The thaw came slow. First the snow pulled back from the edges of buildings, then from the road, leaving behind a slush that soaked boots through by midday. Mud swallowed cartwheels. The river cracked and shifted, dark water showing beneath like a mirror too honest to look into. Miriam tied her skirts high and worked through the mess, hauling sacks at the store, helping Miss Greeley boil linens, dragging Ruth on a sled when the girl's legs gave out from fever. The others caught colds and shook them off, but Ruth clung to hers like it was part of her. Kerrigan noticed. He always did. He came by the loft one morning with a tin of something sharp-smelling and set it by the quilts without a word. Miriam rubbed it on Ruth's chest that night and stayed awake listening to the rasp of her breath. She was thinner now. All of them were. That night when the little one slept, Miriam slipped outside. Kerrigan was sitting on the church steps, coat unbuttoned despite the cold. She crossed the street and sat beside him, not asking. "Preacher don't use it much," he said. "Maybe he's waiting for better people." Kerrigan cracked a dry smile. "That could take a while." They sat a while longer, watching the wind carry the smell of thawing earth across the street. Somewhere in the dark a dog barked. A window slammed shut. The world moved on. "I didn't mean to stay here," she said. He didn't look at her, but she felt him listening. "I thought we'd go south. Maybe find work at one of the mills. But I didn't know how to get there." Kerrigan reached into his coat and pulled out a small pocket knife. The blade was worn dull, the handle polished from years of use. He opened it, turned it once in his hand, then offered it to her. "Was my father's," he said. "He gave it to me when I turned 15. Told me it wasn't good for much, but reminding a man where he came from." She looked down at it, hesitant. "I can't take that." "I didn't say it was a gift," he said. "Just that I want you to carry it a while." She took it. The weight surprised her, not heavy but solid. "Real." "Do you think you'll leave?" she asked. He shrugged. "Was planning to. Before winter." "What changed?" He didn't answer. Beside them the wind picked up and tugged at her coat. Somewhere in the dark a train's whistle sounded long, low, and lonely. They both turned toward the sound, but neither stood. "You said your pa taught you to build fires in snow," she said after a while. He nodded. "You teach your own son that someday." "I might," he said, "if I have one." She looked at him, the sharp line of his jaw, the scar that cut through one brow. There were things he never spoke about, war, things, death things, but she saw the way he carried them. Careful. Never too close to the surface. Like he didn't want to break anyone else with his pieces. "You'd be a good one," she said, voice low. His eyes met hers. "You think so?" She nodded once. "I know so." They sat in the quiet for a long time after that, the sound of the wind and the night breathing around them. And when she rose to go, he walked her back to the loft, stopping just shy of the ladder. "I could put in a word with the landlord," he said. "There's parcels out near my grandfather's land. Empty. They owe me a favor or two." Miriam looked at him. "You offering me land?" "I'm offering a place to start." She didn't answer, but her hand tightened around the knife in her pocket. That night she lay beside her children and didn't dream of escape. She dreamed of a house with light in the windows and a field with rows straight as prayer. Spring arrived in fits, as if the land didn't quite trust warmth yet. Ice melted and refroze. Calves were born early and died in the frost. But buds showed on the trees and the river ran faster each day, swollen with snowmelt. Miriam stood on the ridge where Kerrigan had first brought her his grandfather's land. It was still rough, wild, filled with brush and the bones of trees that hadn't made it through winter. But it wasn't empty. The ground was softening. You could dig now. Kerrigan stood a few paces off, driving a stake into the soil. He'd found a way. Brought the papers to her himself, his thumb smudged across the signature line like he still didn't believe they'd said yes. The parcel was hers. Not borrowed. Not loaned. Hers. She didn't cry, but her hands shook when she signed. They worked side by side for weeks, clearing brush and hauling stone. John came too, his shoulders already squaring like a man's. Kerrigan showed him how to brace a beam and notch a post. The boy never smiled much, but he worked hard, and the silence between him and Kerrigan, turned into something easy, like men who knew how to speak without saying much. The girls gathered stones for the hearth. Eli chased field mice with a stick and reported back on where the enemy lines were. Ruth stayed close to Miriam, her cough nearly gone now, cheeks pinked up from the sun. One afternoon, as they laid the first sill beam, Kerrigan straightened and looked out over the rise. "You ever think you'd do this?" he asked. "No," she said. "I thought I'd end up in some mill town with all my babies coughing to death." He didn't laugh, just nodded. "But now I've got 5. He raised a brow. She looked over at John and the girls, then back at Kerrigan. "You count?" He looked away, face unreadable. But something passed through him, quiet as a shadow, soft as belief. Later they sat by the fire pit, drinking coffee from tin cups and watching the sky darken. The children had curled up in quilts nearby, dirt-smudged and content. Ruth lay with her head in Miriam's lap, breathing steady. Kerrigan stirred the embers with a stick. "My mother died in a camp near Galveston," he said, voice low. "Yellow fever took most of the women there. She held on long enough to bury the youngest. After that she just stopped eating." Miriam didn't interrupt. "I was 16. Walked north until I ran out of road." He dropped the stick into the fire and leaned back on his palms. "Thought if I kept moving, I wouldn't carry it with me. Did it work?" He shook his head. "But it gave me something else. Men taught me to shoot, to fix things, to live lean. That's how I lasted. Not how I wanted to." Miriam reached into her coat and pulled out the pocket knife he'd given her. She held it out. "I believe you can want something better now." He didn't take it. He just looked at her, and in the firelight his eyes were soft in a way that startled her. "I believe you already do." He looked down, then finally reached out, not for the knife, but for her hand. Rough fingers, calloused and warm, closing over hers like a vow. They sat like that, the fire low and the children breathing deep behind them. And for the first time in years, Miriam let herself lean just a little into someone else. Word got around, as it always did in towns like that. Quiet at first, just glances, a shift in tone when Miriam walked into the store or when Kerrigan rode into town with one of the children riding double behind him. Nobody said much, but silence carried just as strong as talk. Then the letters started. Cresswell handed her the first one with a look that didn't say much but didn't have to. The envelope was neat. The name on the front wasn't hers. Jonas Cole, estate of. Inside the words were plain. A lawyer's tone. Jonas's brother had filed a claim in Kansas saying the land Jonas left behind, what little it had been worth, should have gone to blood, not to a woman who wasn't named on the deed. "He never came for us," she said flatly, staring at the words. Kerrigan sat beside her on the store porch, one boot braced on the step. "You want me to burn it?" he asked. She folded the letter slowly, carefully. "No. I want to answer it." They filed the counterclaim a week later, with Cresswell and Miss Greeley signing statements and Kerrigan vouching for every word. "But it wasn't just land the brother wanted." He wrote again. Said he'd be coming through. Said maybe the children should come with him. Miriam read that letter with shaking hands. She didn't cry, didn't raise her voice. But when she put it down, she walked out into the yard and split wood until her hands bled. That night she told Kerrigan everything. "Jonas used to say no man would want what he left behind," she said. "Said I was spoiled ground." Kerrigan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "He was a liar," he said. She looked at him, eyes rimmed red. What if he wasn't wrong? He didn't answer at first. Just let the silence settle. Then he said, "You ever look at your children, really look?" She nodded. "Then you know better. There's nothing spoiled about you. When the brother came, he came in a fine coat, riding a tall horse like he was owed something." He looked at the cabin rising out of the earth, and at the children working the garden bed with John. He looked at Miriam like she was a problem. "You think this is a life," he said. Miriam stood between him and the cabin. "I know it is." Kerrigan stepped out from the barn, rifle in hand, not pointed, just resting across his arms. "You've said your piece," Kerrigan told him. "Now ride on." But the man smiled slick and slow. "I got papers," he said. "And lawyers." Miriam stepped forward. "So do I." He looked at her then. Really looked. And something in her eyes made him flinch, not from fear, but from knowing he'd lost. The kind of look a woman carries when she's buried her shame and found her hands again. He rode off. Never came back. That night, Kerrigan sat with the children while Miriam walked out to the edge of the property, where the stones she and Ruth had laid now circled a small sapling. She knelt there, pressed her palm to the dirt, and whispered something soft. Not to Jonas, but to herself, to the part of her that had believed him for too long. When she came back to the fire, Kerrigan stood. She stopped in front of him, the night air cool between them. "I'm not asking," he said, "but I need to know." She looked at him, this man who'd carried her children on his back, who'd bled beside her in the cold, who'd never once asked her to be anything but who she was. "Yes," she said. "If you're asking, the answer's yes." He stepped forward, then, not quick but certain, took her hand, held it like it was worth something. And in the dark, under stars too many to count, she leaned her head to his chest and breathed like the earth was finally still. By midsummer, the cabin stood solid on its stone foundation, its roof pitched clean against the sky, smoke curling from its chimney like a slow breath. The fields stretched green around it, rows of beans, potatoes, corn starting to reach. Miriam's hands were stained from the soil, her nails broken, arms strong. The children had grown too. John was taller than she remembered, noticing, his voice deeper, his steps heavier. Eli chased frogs and came home covered in bruises and stories. The girls sang to themselves while they weeded. Ruth ran barefoot now, her cough all but gone. Kerrigan moved like a man who knew where he belonged. He never claimed the house as his own, not out loud. He just showed up early, stayed late, fixed the door when it stuck, brought nails without asking. When the roof leaked during the first storm, he slept sitting up with a hammer in his hand. They hadn't spoken vows, not in front of anyone, but something older than paper had passed between them the night Miriam said yes. He still kept his place in town, still walked the long ride each morning, but she'd started setting out 2 mugs instead of 1. And when she went to bed, she no longer braced herself for ghosts. One quiet evening, Kerrigan brought a carved box into the house and set it on the table. No explanation, just nodded toward it. Miriam opened it slowly. Inside was the knife, the one he'd given her in winter. She stared at it, then looked up at him. "I want you to keep it now," he said. "As yours?" Her throat tightened. She ran her thumb along the worn handle. Then she set it down and crossed to him. "Stay," she said. "Not just at night. Stay for good." His arms went around her like he'd been waiting, like the words had pulled the last hinge loose from whatever wall he'd kept between them. They were married at the chapel that fall. No white dress. No music. Just Kerrigan in his Sunday shirt and Miriam in her best coat, and the children standing in a crooked line beside them. The preacher mumbled his way through it, and when he finally said the words, Kerrigan looked at her like he already knew what he was promising. No one clapped. No one cried. But after Miss Greeley handed Miriam a small cloth bundle inside a ring made from old copper wire and a chipped porcelain button, found it in a drawer, the woman said, "Figured it wanted a second life." Miriam slid it on and didn't take it off again. The town changed after that. Not loud, not quick, but steady. Folks who'd turned their heads before now nodded to Kerrigan like he'd earned something. Miriam got offered real work, not pity jobs, but paid ones. She cleaned the schoolhouse, helped midwife a neighbor's child, taught 3 girls how to sew. People began to ask her for things. That winter the storms came early and hard, but this time the fire never went out. On a night when the wind rattled the windows and the children slept pressed together for warmth, Kerrigan stepped out into the dark and returned with a small bundle of sticks. On top of them sat a toy horse he'd carved for Eli. "I thought he might like something that doesn't kick," he said. Miriam reached for the bundle, then paused. "Come spring," she said softly, "there'll be another one." He blinked, not understanding at first. Then he did, and in the dim light he let out a sound, half laugh, half breath, and pressed his hand gently to her belly. They stood like that for a long time. The wind blew, the fire cracked, and inside the cabin life moved forward. If the West still calls, subscribe and answer it.